This is Alderney, a tiny scrap of land in the English Channel, part of the Channel Islands archipelago. But its size belies its importance. It's played a very strategic part in British and French history because that's the French coast just over there. And yet these islands, for, well, 1,000 years or so, have on and off mostly belonged to the English and British. And that means that this island has a wealth of historical sites, quite out of proportion to its small size. I'll be exploring the remnants of Alderney's military occupiers, from Roman ramparts to the mega bunkers built by the Wehrmacht. Nowhere gives a sense of the breadth of Alderney's history better than this place here, because this actually takes us back, well, to some of the earliest recorded history in Alderney. It's Roman. Check out that wall. That's actually a Roman remain. It's got to be one of the best Roman remains I've ever seen in the British Isles. You can see the herringbone formation there. What's interesting is that the arch in the middle is 18th century. When the British came to refortify this Roman fort against the French threat of the French Revolution, the walls had been surrounded by sand over the centuries as they had to extend this arch up. And if you look at the very top level here, above that herringbone, you can see the 18th century addition. But the most remarkable thing about this building is it wasn't just fortified by the British in the 18th century, but by another occupier even later on. So the Roman structure was used by the British. It was sort of reoccupied, refortified by the British in the 18th century, which gives it its sort of 18th century character inside here. But there's some rather incongruous clues that show what happened during the Second World War, when this island became a vital German defensive stronghold. Look, the closer you look, the more concrete you see. Into these walls, under the ground here, the Germans burrowed bunkers, machine gun positions, and you've got the Edelweiss up here. So there's very few places in the world that I've been where it shows military occupation by the Romans, the British, and then the Wehrmacht. The Germans used existing structures, they built new structures and created a giant interconnected stronghold here on Alderney. This is fascinating. This is the only example in existence in Europe, a German machine gun position where the gun is braced on these little notches here and someone can stand in here and feed fresh ammunition in. And as you can see here, this machine gun crew would have had a perfect field of fire along that beach. But this is just one of hundreds of military structures right across this tiny island. When France fell to the Germans in June 1940, the decision was made to demilitarise and abandon the Channel Islands. The British government realised they couldn't put up any resistance against German forces now that they were so close in occupied France. In Alderney, the civilian population was evacuated. They left on British ships and were taken either to other Channel Islands or to the British mainland. And that meant that when the Germans landed, they found this place almost completely empty. This is Alderney's harbour, and as a result, it is incredibly strongly defended. You can see fortifications on the far side, but look at the headland I'm on now. Everywhere, as far as the eye can see, dotted with bunkers, gun positions, searchlight positions. We know that in the immediate area here, there were 11 artillery pieces, including anti-tank guns that could have fired at ships or troops landing in this area here, and also 9 anti-aircraft guns which can actually be lowered so they can fire at targets on the surface as well. So this was an incredibly strong position. It feels like Alderney had been turned into one gigantic, static, potent battleship out here in the sea. As the Second World War progressed, it became clear to the Germans that the Allies were planning a major invasion of Western Europe, gathering forces in Britain. In response, the Germans decided to fortify the Channel Islands, turning them into a theoretically impregnable string of fortresses
that would guard the stretch of French coast to the west of the Cotentin Peninsula.
Now, Alderney might be one of the smallest of the Channel Islands, but it became the most heavily fortified. Gun platforms like this one here were built. Now, right here in the middle, they'd have mounted big naval guns, the kinds that were installed on German battleships, and these would have allowed the Germans to close off this passage. Over there you can see Guernsey, over there you can see Jersey. The guns here would overlap with guns fired over there, forming a kind of invisible wall through which Allied shipping wouldn't be allowed to pass. Over there is the coast of France, so on the other side of Alderney you'd have guns that would close off that gap as well. So this whole stretch of French coast and these coastal convoy routes that the Germans wanted to take would be protected. Alderney was covered in concrete. The Germans burrowed into the earth. This is where I'm standing now. You've got this huge gun platform. Each one was protected against invasion. There were 3 rings of barbed wire around this one. There was a minefield. There were flamethrowers. Over there on those 2 little hillocks, there was anti-aircraft guns. In the middle, there was a strong point. Dozens and dozens of these kind of features absolutely littered this tiny island, turning it into one massive fortress.
Barring the Roman fort overlooking the island's harbour, Alderney was home to very few fortifications up until the 18th century. In this period, Britain and France continued to compete for world domination, and the threat of an amphibious invasion of southern England was always on the cards, magnifying the strategic importance of the Channel Islands.
This is a particularly fascinating site. This is Fort Torgy. Now we think, well, somewhere around here on this headland there would have been an 18th century gun battery. During the 18th century, Britain and France were fighting basically for control of the world, global hegemony. In the 19th century, Britain and France again found themselves in competition. It was a huge naval arms race, and the Victorians built a lot of forts around the coast of the British Isles, but nowhere more remarkable than this one here. This protected the coast here in Alderney. You've got Bray Harbour over there. This was a place where French troops could have landed. So you've got these giant gun platforms here built by the Victorians facing out to sea. But what's amazing about this place is basically on top of this Victorian site, you have German defences added on. You literally can see on top of these Georgian foundations, you've got the concrete here, and there would have been German machine guns here, larger caliber German weapons. This headland would have bristled with defensive weaponry. Check out down here. So this is wonderful. You're coming through these thick Victorian walls now, down this tunnel. At the bottom, you leave the red brick of the Victorian period behind, and you have the concrete of wartime construction, and down here you have German gun emplacements, anti-tank weapons and machine gun positions. Look at that. Classic, a beach there, Bray Harbour, an ideal place where enemy troops might land, and this gun is just able to sweep that entire area. So this German fort, built on top of the Victorian fort, would have had, well, up to 70 German soldiers in it, and the garrison of Alderney was something like 3,500, and then plus 4,000 or so slave labourers. Remarkable. So this is where the big German gun would have been, as you can see, sweeping that beach, dealing with landing craft or attacking troops. And there would have been about 4 big guns of this calibre in this German fort, and then numerous machine guns, really too many to have left an accurate record. What really strikes me when I look around this place and seeing the size, seeing the scale, is the thought that this was a huge complex, really. There would have been a crew here protected from naval, aerial bombardment or assault from the sea. There would have been a generator. There was a huge amount of ammunition here. There had been cooking and facilities and sewerage, and that all had been brought together. It had all been built here just to keep one gun in operation.
Construction and maintenance of the fortifications on the island was not easy, especially with the threat of Allied air attacks. The RAF launched numerous bombing raids on the Channel Islands, 22 in total throughout the war, aiming to destroy German bunkers and disable gun emplacements. The Germans had to be prepared.
So it wasn't just guns that were positioned all over the coast here in Alderney. they needed searchlights because many of the giant Allied air formations that struck targets in Europe would do so at night. So this is a great example of a searchlight position. These would have been huge searchlights, 60 centimetres in diameter. They had to be moved on these tracks. And they'd have been here on the coast looking to pick out these giant Allied air armadas. They're heading over to bomb targets, particularly in July and August of 1944 in the Great Battle for Normandy. And then once they'd been picked up, then the German anti-aircraft positions could try and shoot them down. There were 37 searchlights of 60 centimetres in diameter and above on Alderney alone. Just driving around Alderney, you get a sense of the concentration of military architecture on this island, going right back to the Romans. Then a lot, of course, the Victorian stuff still remaining, but the Second World War features are everywhere across this island. It's impossible to go more than a few metres without seeing a little bunker, a little piece of concrete sticking out of the undergrowth. It's one of the most remarkable places.
Next, I would be travelling to the northern tip of Alderney to see one of those impressive World War II fortifications at Bibbet Head.
This is a remarkable bunker. I don't think I've ever really seen anything like this one. They've clad it with rock that they've picked up from the beach around and about, and they've disguised the outside of this bunker to make it try and blend in with this rocky headland that I'm on. So inside here, it's just another giant complex to house big beach defence guns, artillery pieces, and then there would have been machine guns, so the loopholes in the wall, and then places for the crew to live as well. And apparently there's a long tunnel. Yeah, here we go. A long tunnel connecting us with another. Wow. Connecting us with another artillery position out on the headland. Let's go. The scale of this construction effort is extraordinary. I'm constantly getting surprised every time I go to a new bunker. You think you've seen it all. Wow. And this bit's very badly flooded. Oh yeah, and that chamber beyond as well. I think I might, at this point, turn back rather than have wet feet for the rest of my expedition in Alderney. Although they're less immediately obvious than the giant German concrete emplacements, also crisscrossing this island are these trenches. Now you might think you'd be more likely to find trenches like this on the battlefields of the First World War, on the Western Front, Flanders, etc. But actually they were used during the Second World War, particularly here on Alderney, to link different German positions together. And you can see this one is hewn out of the living rock. It stretches all the way up behind me up to that fortress on the hill. Here's another stretch of trench now. Allows the German defenders, the German garrison, to move between different positions, always staying low, staying below ground level. And this is a mortar position. There's a mortar here. This trench system actually joins a couple of different mortar positions together. Now a mortar is a gun basically that fires bombs high up in the air that land then on the heads of your enemy.
After a long tour of the island's defensive structures, tunnels and trenches, it was time to head to Alderney's most iconic World War II landmark.
I'm on the eastern tip of Alderney now, and you get a fantastic view from here across the Narrows to France. That's the tip of the Cotentin Peninsular in Normandy. And look how close we are to France, only about 9 kilometres away. And look at that tide ripping through there, one of the most infamous tidal races in the world. Now, this was the gap that the Germans wanted to protect. And so this artillery here would work with this gigantic building here, this was effectively kind of a rangefinder, an observation tower. Each of those 3 layers had German observers looking out to sea, and then each of the 3 layers talked to a different battery. Underground telephone cables went out to a battery of big heavy guns that could then work to bring down gigantic weight of fire on enemy ships spotted through there. Enemy ships foolish enough to try and get through this gap because there was another set of giant artillery pieces on the French coast as well. So between Alderney and the guns over there, this gap, this route along the coast of France was shut to Allied shipping. Most accessible bunker in the world, but worth it because look at this. This is, well, painting murals from the 1940s, and what's fascinating is that the German crew down here obviously tried to create, well, make it sort of comfortable, tried to beautify it slightly because they didn't particularly enjoy living in a concrete box underground. Look at this. Wow. Oh yeah, look, this is fantastic. Still chipboard. So providing a sort of inner wall, covering up the concrete, just making the room feel a bit warmer, feel a bit less barren. And these, there would have been, I think, beds that would have hung down from here. You've still got some of the fittings up there, so they would have had chained bunks along here. Wow. Oh, look over here. Check this out. Incredibly beautiful painting here, and then you've got some German words here, which I think say danger of death if you don't close that valve. Funny juxtaposition, warning people of a mortal danger, right next door to this rather beautiful sort of flowery and leafy motif here.
And those that were in mortal danger were the thousands of slave labourers brought over to Alderney from Europe and North Africa as part of Nazi construction programmes. The workforce also included natives of the Channel Islands.
The gigantic scale of military building here on Alderney required a huge army of workers to finish it. And those workers were found from around Hitler's Nazi empire and moved here by force. They were forced labourers. They were housed in a number of camps around Alderney, of which very little remains. They were deconstructed after the war, and they were housed in such flimsy and miserable conditions that little of it is still upstanding, unlike the huge concrete structures that they built. But here you can see the remains of some of the accommodation in one of the camps, the hard standing down there, which would have been covered with a flimsy shelter. The conditions under which those labourers were held were pretty brutal. They were denied access to healthcare and proper food, and many of them died whilst being forced to work on this island.
More than 700 camp inmates lost their lives before the camps were closed and the remaining inmates transferred to France in 1944. The Channel Islands were liberated in 1945 following the German surrender, and the horrors of the only concentration camp to be built on British soil were exposed.
The Channel Islands remained in German hands almost till the very last hours of the Second World War. The Allies bypassed them. They liberated France. They moved into the Low Countries, into Germany, and brought the Second World War in Europe to a close, leaving these islands in German hands. So all of the work that had been done to fortify them, protect them from an Allied amphibious assault, work that cost the lives of so many of the thousands of slave labourers that were brought here, was in vain. When the people of Alderney returned, they found an island that was much changed. Tens of thousands of landmines, trench systems, bunkers, concrete fortifications crisscrossing their home. And those had been built by slave labourers, many of whom had been worked to death. And the islanders immediately responded by building this rather moving memorial to those slave labourers. French language, Hebrew, Polish, reflecting the different nationalities of people that were brought here by the Nazis in order to turn this into one mighty fortress.
I hope you've enjoyed this tour of Alderney's fascinating historical sites. If you did, Make sure to check out these other great World War II videos on the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe.